I'm going to be talking to Dr. James Bushnell, who's a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, about a paper he wrote around low carbon fuel standards and the adoption of EV programs. So welcome to the interview, Jim.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, why don't we start off with an overview of your paper, please?
Sure. And the paper really has two goals. One is to make a high-level point about policy choices, climate policy choices, and another is to sort of present those arguments in the context of a specific regulation, the low carbon fuel standard. So I'll start with the high-level point, and it really tries to get at there's at least two big dimensions that people are arguing about in climate policy. The first is whether technology neutrality should be a centerpiece of climate policies, whether we should focus on attributes like low carbon and not get too into the weeds in terms of picking specific technology solutions to get us there, or whether we need to pick specific technologies. Some people call it the picking winners strategy, and really just put our chips in on the specific pathways that we've identified as the best routes for trying to decarbonize. So that's the first dimension, technology neutrality versus sort of picking winners. The second dimension is how we pay for these things. If whatever technology emerges from that first debate, we're going to need some kind of source of funds to pay for the transition. And the low carbon fuel standard, which is the subject of the paper, really is a regulation that kind of encapsulates in all of these dimensions and the debates about them in one regulation. So it was a great context, a great case study for this.
Why don't we start also with a definition? If you could explain what the California low carbon fuel standard is, please.
Yeah, so the low carbon fuel standard is a specific, very complex regulation that's a type of standard, and this is the favored policy tool right now in government circles. It's certainly the favorite tool of the Biden administration as a broad level, the standard. The low carbon fuel standard, the general idea is for transportation fuels to reduce the carbon intensity of the overall average fuel being used by Californians, or it's also in use in several other US states and some Canadian provinces as well. So the idea is to reduce the carbon intensity of each gallon of fuel, if you will, rather than regulating the total amount of carbon. So we're not limiting the total amount of gasoline being consumed or of transportation fuels being consumed, but we are reducing the carbon intensity, the tons per mile, if you will, or tons per gallon of the fuel itself.
So my understanding in California is that that includes refineries buying cheap, high carbon oil and blending it with more expensive low carbon fuel to come up to meet this, basically meet the standard.
Yeah, the original sort of dominant paradigm was liquid fuels, where you kind of can mix together some conventional petroleum-based gasoline with ethanol and other types of biofuels that would be of lower carbon intensity. And you get your motor fuel down from, say, a baseline of 95, as the units are confusing, down to something that's 10% less carbon intensive by basically blending in lower fuels. And it's an easier type of regulation to implement because you're talking about the same kind of fuel, liquid, going into the same vehicles, and you're just displacing it. And as we'll discuss, it gets a little more complicated when you start to take this idea into electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles or some more dramatically different modes of transportation.
Well, that's my next question. How do you use a low carbon fuel standard to promote electrification of transportation?
Yeah, and this is where the ideas behind the low carbon fuel standard, they still have a really heavy detailed amount of formulas and assumptions behind them, and they start to sort of add up to many different ways in which a regulator could tip the scales one way or the other for one fuel or another. In the case of electric vehicles, the general idea is you have to make an assumption about first, how many kilowatts are actually going into vehicles. Once you have an idea of that, how much fuel, the electricity is being used, then you have to make an assumption about how much that's actually displacing of conventional fuels. And then you have to also make some assumptions about what the carbon intensity of the electricity itself that is being consumed might be. And in each of these cases, they're actually quite difficult questions to answer, where measurement is rather imperfect. And they each represent sort of ways in which one could kind of make an assumption one way or the other. And if you really wanted to favor electric vehicles, you could make those assumptions more favorable. That seems to be what's happening.
Would it not be simpler to take whatever taxes are collected or fees, whatever, however you want to describe them, but take that money that's collected under a low carbon fuel standard and simply use it to subsidize electric vehicle sales?
Well, it's a great question, and this is where the important distinction between a standard like the low carbon fuel standard and a tax or even a cap and trade program comes in. That with a standard, there is no money changing hands to the government. It's all internal to an industry. So with an electricity renewable standard or with a low carbon fuel standard, essentially what happens is the dirty producers, in this case, the petroleum-based fuel providers, essentially pay a tax, but the tax gets paid to the low carbon fuel producers. The government is not directly involved. So essentially you have two parties within the same fuels industry. The dirtier ones are subsidizing the cleaner ones. And this represents a whole bunch of advantages from certain process perspectives, but it limits the ability of the government to sort of direct which way the funds are going, and also has some other downsides.
What are some of those other downsides?
Well, one of the ones that's been encountered is there's no ability to provide a minimum or a price floor on the cost of these low carbon credits that are going around. In the California Cap and Trade Program, we have a minimum price basically enforced by just selling less carbon allowances if the price gets too low, because the government doesn't control the number of low carbon fuel allowances in circulation. They don't have really the ability to manage the range of prices that these low carbon fuel credits might be trading at.
Okay. Now, a question for you. It seems to be, I'm going to call it a consensus of many of the analysts I talk to, that basically light duty vehicles, cars and pickup trucks, will be electrified. Now, medium and heavy duty may go to other fuels like hydrogen, but electricity seems to be the winner on the light duty side. So if that's the case, the government doesn't have to pick a winner. The winner's already been picked by the marketplace and the development of the technologies. Does that make it easier, or does it make it more difficult?
Well, a standard is least dangerous in a case where the winner is obvious. And then if you basically pick a standard that's picking the obvious best technology, then yeah, then you're actually not limiting what might happen. I think it's a little early to declare EVs the dominant winner. And I think one of the questions is not so much, will EVs play an important role in the light duty vehicle fleet? I think there's no question that will be the case. But it's really a question around exactly what that mix might be. And EVs, as you're aware, are still a very small portion of the overall passenger fleet in the United States. It's growing remarkably fast, but from such a low baseline that the numbers in aggregate are quite small right now. There's a lot of excitement and a lot of certainly activity around introducing new EVs, but I guess our point is we don't quite know exactly what the right optimal mix of, say, electric vehicles versus hydrogen vehicles versus some maybe esoteric low carbon biofuel options might be, even for passengers. And the degree to which we decide that we're going to ban certain technologies or go all in on other technologies is limiting our options. And do we want to put those constraints in now? Or do we want to let a more technology neutral competition happen before we get to the point of seeing which one does emerge? Does
your paper come to any conclusions about answering that question, whether or not you want to change the low carbon fuel standard to favor certain technologies or be technology neutral?
Well, this is more of an explainer piece, and we tried to be agnostic on that. So I guess the main point we were trying to make is right now, from the numbers that we're seeing, there's really two choices: that you could maintain the low carbon fuel standard as a really objectively technology neutral standard, or you could use it to fund massive, to direct large amounts of funds to electrification. I don't think you can do both right now. And we do highlight a few ways in which the current low carbon fuel standard seems to favor electrification over other options. One sort of really clear one is you can earn low carbon credits for installing EV charging stations. So there's an infrastructure-based credit, which is kind of a new idea. Generally, low carbon fuel standard was supposed to fund the sale of low carbon fuels, not the infrastructure that supports it. And there's no analogous credits for installing, for example, E85 pumps for very high concentration ethanol, which is another infrastructure barrier that we've encountered for on the biofuel side. So there have been some choices that seem to favor specific technologies. And we're sort of moving along with that. Maybe that's consistent with California's goal, because California has kind of basically come out and said that it wants a lot of electric vehicles. And so the choice seems to have almost been made within California that that supporting electric vehicles is a priority over technology neutrality. And we're trying to kind of make that a little more clear.
Is the California experience with low carbon fuel standards and transportation electrification, is it instructive for other jurisdictions, whether, it's state level in Canada, or sorry, in the United States, or in amongst the Canadian provinces?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's still debates over exactly what the lessons are, but there are many states that have come to California to both just examine how we've implemented it, and many states that have actually just piggybacked on the immense amount of staff work that goes into developing some of the calculations behind the low carbon fuel standard. Every type of fuel you could imagine has a detailed analysis of its life cycle carbon intensity. And those numbers go into scoring all the different fuels and determining how many credits each fuel might have. There are a lot of places that are looking at how California does that, and many of them are just adopting our formulas as is.
Final question then, Jim. Based on that experience, may we assume that over the, in the near future, we're going to see, quite a number of other states go the same direction as California?
Yes, although it's interesting, there's been a lot of discussion about low carbon fuel standards being applied both nationally and within state coalitions, but also simultaneously there are states like New York that are considering a separate tax or cap and trade program for their transportation fuels specifically. So like California, I think there's likely to be multiple regulations that impact the transportation sector, and the low carbon fuel standard will be one of them. But whether it will be kind of the most significant or most prominent, I think remains to be seen.
Great, Jim, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks.